morning. It's been about a year and a half since I've been here. It's great to be back. So what has happened in the last year and a half? We kept marching, we kept lobbying, we kept protesting, we kept organizing in key districts across the state, and this fall we passed the first electoral code rewrite in Pennsylvania since 1937. This April 2020, when you vote in the primary election, I hope, and you all better vote in the primary election, I hope that you vote by mail, which will be something that you can do for the first time in Pennsylvania history. Up to 50 days before the election, you can send in your ballot by mail. No excuse needed. If somebody is not registered and you're 16 days out from the election, you can register them. It used to be a 30-day deadline. Now you can register up to 15 days before, and a few other smaller things in that bill. Also, we passed open primaries through the Senate. We'll get that through the House soon enough. I think that's pretty, we're not quite there, but. Gift ban. We got the gift ban through the House State Government Committee last week, or 2 weeks ago now, and it's headed to a floor vote in the House where it will pass, and then it should pass through the Senate and get signed by the governor into law. And gerrymandering is still a mess. Some quick updates to put on your calendar, some dates. May 1st to May 3rd, 2020, we are marching from York to Harrisburg. 30 miles, springtime stroll along the Susquehanna. Should be really nice. June 20th, 2020, the Poor People's Campaign, the mass moral gathering and March on Washington is happening. June 20th, 2020. I'll see you in DC that day, June 20th, 2020. But that's all I'm going to say about March on Harrisburg and the Poor People's Campaign today, because usually on a Sunday morning, I am in Hebrew school. I'm teaching Sunday school. And I want to look at a question that comes up again and again and again, no matter what age I teach, no matter which Sunday school I teach in. And that is a simple question that we have been asking for a long time. Where was God in Auschwitz? Where was God in Treblinka? Where was God in Dachau? Where was God in Theresienstadt? Where was God in the Warsaw Ghetto? Where was God? And when you ask that question, we must also ask ourselves, where is the divine in Burke's Family Detention Center? Where is God while thousands die from lack of health care? Where is holiness when we poison ourselves and choke on our own poisons? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once said that during Auschwitz, God just wasn't looking, just didn't see us. God had turned away. And this phenomenon in Hebrew is called hester panim, which means the hiding of the face. The face just turns away from us, doesn't see us. And of course, this is a metaphor, as most things are. And the reality is that we don't see each other, that our faces have turned away from each other, that we don't hear each other, that we become indifferent to each other. And there are many things in humanity, there are many things in our society, there are many things in our world that cause us to turn away from each other. Racism is an obvious one. Racism is when we don't quite see each other, when we prejudge each other. Heschel once said that racism is an eye disease. It's when you see the generality of the race before you see the particularity of the face, prejudged based on predetermined conceptions. And so you are blind to the person in front of you. And this, like all other divisions, acts as a cancer of the soul. Misogyny blinds us. Homophobia blinds us. All of these things blind us, keep us from seeing each other, from relating to each other on a human level. And corruption blinds us. Corruption deafens us to each other. In Pennsylvania, we have a very corrupt problem. Corruption, that's the corrupt problem. Our government is corrupt. It has been privatized. It has been hijacked. It has been shanghaied. It has been stolen from us. The nature of corruption is such that we don't see the people we need to see the most. And because we don't see them, we don't care, and we are not responsive, and we are not responsible. 2,600 years ago, the prophet Isaiah said, "Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They chase after bribes. The widow and the orphan's cause does not come before them." Right now, the political elite of Pennsylvania, I can tell you where they all are right at this moment. They are not here. They are not in the state of Pennsylvania. They are right now in New York City. They are there for something called the Pennsylvania Society Gala. Every year, this time of year, the political establishment of Pennsylvania heads up, usually to the Waldorf Astoria, which is currently under construction, so they're down the road, and they get bribed, and they wine and dine, and they chase after bribes, and they hang out with their partners, rebels and thieves, and they talk about what's going to happen the next year and who's going to fund who, and what are you going to do for me to get that money? That's where they are right now. You can see that their schedule was posted on Penn Live a few days ago. You can see what they're up to, exactly what they're up to. It's shameless. And the widow and the orphan's cause does not come before them. 1 in 8 children in Pennsylvania lives in deep poverty. 1 in 2 children in Pennsylvania is either in poverty or right on the border of it. And yet our rulers are hanging out in Manhattan, getting bribed. With corruption, corruption causes violence. It causes suffering. The prophet Ezekiel once said, "In you are people who take bribes to shed blood." In you are people who take bribes to shed blood. 67 kids with Ewing sarcoma cancer are going to die in southwestern Pennsylvania because they happen to live near fracking sites. There's now talk about moving the Philadelphia airport because it's going to be underwater in a few years. This is violence. Pennsylvania produces 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. This is violence. Why don't they get it? Why don't they see the truth? Because while Pennsylvania has 203 state representatives, we also have 203 natural gas lobbyists. Because Pennsylvania gets bribed to the tune of $5 to $9 million a year by lobbyists for the industry, and then about that same amount in campaign contributions. They own the process. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 16, "Do not take a bribe, because a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous." Too often, our wise leaders are blind, and they become unwise. And the words of the righteous who call out for justice are twisted and silenced. When we turn away from each other, when we are blinded to each other, when we are deaf to each other, we suffer. We have become a bit too reliant on some ideas that are not going to save us. I'd like to take a moment to address the concept of rights. We all think in terms of rights. I have the right, you have no right, we have the right. I have the right to property, I have the right to life, I have the right to a safe and clean environment. But every time we think in terms of rights, we start automatically with I. I have the right. And it becomes an individual experience. And we become blind to each other. There is no sense of right in the Bible. It just doesn't exist. It's a very modern invention, and it has its part, and it's a good thing, and I don't want to downplay rights. But if that's all you have, you lose the relational quality. When you have obligations instead of rights or alongside rights, the obligation starts off with, instead of I have the right to eat, you have the right to feed the hungry. Instead of I have the right to safety, you have the right to protect the vulnerable. Instead of I have the right to seek asylum, you have the obligation to take in the refugee and the stranger and the asylum seeker. And when we think in terms of rights, we can become responsive to each other instead of siloed within ourselves. Because at the end of the day, when everyone else's rights are being challenged, you have the right to stay home. You have the right to sleep in. You have the right to stay in your warm, warm bed on a Tuesday morning when it's raining. You have that right. But overwhelming all your rights is you have the obligation to show up. You have the obligation to sacrifice. In 1944, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was a Polish refugee living in a dorm room in Cincinnati, Ohio. He had escaped from Poland a few years earlier. By way of London, he found himself in Cincinnati. And he sat in a very small dorm room, and he wrote an essay called The Meaning of This War, World War II. And in that essay, he tells a story, and I'd like to share the story with you. He says, there once was a band of mountain climbers, very inexperienced mountain climbers, and they struck out on a long journey, and they were walking along a very rocky, rough ledge. And they fell off the ledge into a deep, dark pit. And in that deep, dark pit, snakes started coming out of every crevice, hissing with their fangs out, ready to attack. And snakes kept coming out, and the climbers were all beating the snakes back as they came out, but more and more and more snakes kept coming. And there was one climber who wasn't helping, who was not helping beat back the snakes. And the other climbers turned to them and said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you helping us? Look at all these snakes that are trying to kill us." And that climber said, "I'm looking for a way out of the pit, because if we stay here, we're all going to die. We need to get out of this pit." How do we get out of the pit? The snakes of our time are upon us. They have been bred for decades in the worst parts of our humanity, and now they have sprung upon us, ready to strike, ready to attack. How do we get out of the pit? Sacrifice. It's an answer as old as time. And I wish I was coming here with something newer to say, but that's the answer. It's sacrifice. Sacrifice gets us out. The Hebrew word for sacrifice is korban, and korban doesn't just mean sacrifice, it also means to encounter. It means to hug each other. It means to get up in the face of that which you cherish the most. And a korban, a sacrifice, allows us to be seen and to be heard, and to force those around us to turn and to see our suffering, and to hear the suffering, and to respond to that suffering. The ancient biblical prayer for when sacrifices were offered, it goes something like this: Yevarechecha Adonai v'yismarecha, Yisar panav elecha v'yichunecha, Yair Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom, which means may the divine turn to you and bless you and keep you, and may the face of the divine turn to you and be gracious to you, and may the face of the divine shine upon you, and may there be peace. When we sacrifice, we are trying to get the face of the divine to turn to us, to be seen. And as such, we are trying to get those around us to turn and to see and to respond and to no longer be indifferent and to claim responsibility. Have you ever heard the line in Amos, "Let justice roll like waters and let righteousness roll like a mighty stream"? Raise your hand if you've heard that line. You've all heard that. Does anyone know how we get there? Amos tells us a few verses before in the chapter, how do you get there? And if you read a few verses back in Amos chapter 5, it's very clear. Go out into the public square and sacrifice. Go out and cry. Don't cry at home. Cry in public. Wail together. Cry out together. See each other in the public square and bawl, cry, wail, until those who you are sacrificing in front of see you, see the suffering, and grow responsive and responsible to it. For if we sacrifice, maybe the face of history will shine brightly upon us, hopefully. It's our best hope. Heschel answers his own question, how do you get out of the pit? And I'd like to read to you what he wrote. And again, he was writing in 1944. Soldiers, in the horror of battle, offer solemn testimony that life is not a hunt for pleasure, but an engagement for service. That there are things more valuable than life. That the world is not a vacuum. Either we make it an altar for holiness, or it is invaded by demons. There can be no neutrality. Either we are ministers of the sacred or slaves of evil. Let the blasphemy of our time not become an eternal scandal. Let future generations not loathe us for having failed to preserve what prophets and saints, martyrs and scholars have created in thousands of years. The fascists have shown that they are great in evil. Let us reveal that we can be as great in goodness. I came here today to ask you, what sacrifices are you making? What sacrifices will you make? What sacrifices do you need to make? Who is not being seen? Who is not being heard? Who is not listening? Who is not seeing? What is your sacrifice going to be? I'm asking for creativity in your sacrifices. I'm asking you to not do what everybody else is doing. I'm asking you to not do what has been done because it has not worked. Here we are. When we sacrifice, we need to be bold. We need to force the encounter. We need to get up into the face of those in power and have them live out the words of Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher who once said, when you see the face of the other, you are ordered and ordained to service. And that is how we must make those in power feel, ordered and ordained to service. A long time ago, there were two brothers. One's name was Cain and one's name was Abel. One day, they got into a conflict, and one killed the other. And the divine comes along and asks a very puzzling question. Where is your brother Abel? Where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, I don't know. And God says, I hear his blood crying out from the ground. I am responsive now. I hear his blood. And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for my brother, for my sister? And the answer that we must give with a resounding force at this moment in time is yes. We are responsible for each other. We are all co-responsible for each other. We are not allowed to turn away from the problems that we face. You have the right to. Don't get me wrong. You all have the right to not listen to a word I'm saying and to turn away and go home and go to sleep and watch a good movie and take a nap and cook a good... You can do all that. You all have the right. But we have the obligation to sacrifice. We have the obligation to sacrifice. I want to close out here with a question. I might get in trouble for asking this question, I realize. Raise your hand if you're willing to go to jail for what you believe in. Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if you haven't yet gone to jail for what you believe in. So everybody who didn't raise your hand the first time or the second time, I hope that you do raise your hand next time. And for everybody that wants to sacrifice yet has not, I wish you good luck and courage and speed in your sacrifice. And on May 4th, 2020, we'll have an opportunity for you in Harrisburg, as we do. When Heschel closed out that essay, the meaning of this war, he tells a story about a moment in history, a moment in cultural mythological history, when the Israelites were standing at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai was where we forged a covenant. But we weren't really standing at Mount Sinai. This little legend goes that we were standing underneath Mount Sinai, that Mount Sinai was over our heads, that the mountain of history was above us, was floating on top of us, and that we had a choice at that moment to either pursue justice or not, to live in chaos, to live in the type of chaos that we had just left in Egypt, or to build a better world, to forge a new covenant. And as the mountain hung over our heads, we had that choice. And luckily at that time, we chose right. Well, the mountain of history once more hangs above our heads. Shall we choose right or wrong? This is yet to be determined. I hope we have the courage to sacrifice and choose right.